Hey guys, tonight we drop you straight into an Old West winter that does not care about your feelings, your paycheck, or your adorable little moustache. You are out on the open range when the sky turns that hard, polished blue and the air feels like it has teeth. The kind of cold that makes metal sting and makes your lungs wonder if breathing is really necessary. And yes, you probably won't survive this if you treat it like a movie montage where you just grit your teeth and dramatically stare into the distance. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And drop a comment with your location and your local time, because I want to picture you listening from wherever you are while you and I freeze together in spirit. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You stand there with your hat pulled low, watching the light drain out of the plains like someone poured it from a bucket. The wind comes first, sliding down out of the north with a clean, vicious confidence. It hits your cheeks and the tip of your nose and instantly starts negotiating for ownership of your face. Your horse shifts under you, ears angled back, not thrilled about this new personality the weather has adopted. The grass is still there, technically, but it has gone brittle and whispery, as if it already knows it is going to spend the night trapped under snow. A cowboy winter is not a single thing. It is a collection of problems that show up all at once and demand to be handled in the dark. Cold, wind, wet. The three troublemakers that walk into camp together like they planned it. When the temperature drops, your sweat stops being your friend and turns into a personal betrayal. Your shirt that felt fine at noon now clings like a cold rag. Your fingers start losing their cleverness, and every task takes twice as long and feels 3 times dumber. You try to roll a cigarette and realize your hands are performing an interpretive dance called Absolutely Not. Out here, a warm shelter does not have to be pretty. It has to interrupt the wind, keep snow from piling on you, and give your fire a chance to live. That is the whole romance. You look across the country and see how empty it is, which is beautiful in the daytime and slightly insulting at night. There is no cabin waiting politely on the horizon. There is no innkeeper with stew. There is just land, a few scattered trees that look like they are reconsidering their career choices, and the sharp fact that the sun is not coming back for a while. You move with the quiet urgency that comes from experience or from watching someone else learn the hard way. If you are riding for a ranch, you might be headed toward a line camp, one of those small practical outposts where cowboys spend winter stretches watching cattle mending fences and trying not to become a frozen rumour. By the 1880s, barbed wire is creeping across the West, and that changes the job. It is not only about moving herds anymore, it is also about boundaries, broken strands, and keeping livestock where someone says they belong. Historians still argue whether those winter camps are mainly about protecting fences and property, or about keeping a closer eye on animals when storms can erase a whole herd overnight. Your eyes keep returning to the same basic question, the one that matters more than pride. Where can you steal a little calm from the wind? A low draw, the lee side of a ridge, a stand of cottonwoods along a creek, their bare branches rattling like bones. You are not looking for comfort. you're looking for a place where the air stops moving long enough for you to make a plan. Wind is what turns cold into cruelty, because it strips heat from you faster than you can replace it. You can endure a lot if the air stands still. You can endure almost nothing if it howls. The first flakes might not even fall yet. Sometimes the brutal part is the waiting, that tightening in the atmosphere. The clouds roll in like a dirty blanket, and the world goes flat and grey. Distant hills lose their edges. Your horse's breath starts showing in thick puffs that hang a moment and then get slapped sideways. You hear the jingle of tack, the faint creak of leather, and you realise sound carries strangely in cold air, as if the whole landscape is listening. You start stripping decisions down to essentials. If you have canvas, you keep it dry. If you have a bedroll, you protect it like it is made of gold, because a wet bedroll is just an expensive way to get hypothermia. You check your matches, your tinder, anything that can catch a flame. Fire is not just warmth, it is morale. It is a little orange argument against the night. You also know fire is picky. It wants shelter too. A strong wind will bully it into smoke and sparks and heartbreak. Your mind runs through the tools you carry. A knife, maybe a small axe or a hatchet, a coil of rope, if you are lucky, a tarp or a piece of canvas. If you are not lucky, you have your saddle blanket and whatever the land is willing to donate. Cowboys get creative because nature does not offer refunds. The quirky truth is that some men swear by stuffing dry grass or crumpled paper inside their clothing for insulation. It is not fashionable, but neither is turning into a popsicle. Someone once claims that a layer of newspaper under a vest is better than a sermon, and you do not argue because the paper is cheap and the wind is rude. You also do that quick mental inventory of your own body, the quiet check-in. Fingers still working, toes still present, face still attached. You flex your hands and feel the sting ease into a dull ache. Your jaw tightens and you remind yourself to drink water even when you do not feel thirsty, because cold air dries you out in a sneaky way. You swallow and the air feels sharp, going down like you are sipping winter itself. Camp, if you have one, is not far. You picture the others, the cook trying to keep things from freezing, the horses nosing each other for warmth, the tired jokes that get told every winter like they are part of the equipment. You can already hear somebody saying, well, it builds character, which is cowboy code for, this is miserable, but we are pretending it is fine. That is joke number one, and it is old enough to have its own bedroll. You finally pick your spot, not because it is perfect, but because it is less terrible than everything else. A shallow bend in the land where the wind breaks a little. A few trees that can serve as a backbone. You slide down from the saddle and your boots crunch on frozen ground with that brittle sound that promises the earth is done being forgiving for the season. Your horse stands close and you cannot blame him. You both want the same thing, which is fewer ways for the cold to touch you. You start moving hands working faster than your thoughts. Even now you feel the temptation to do something heroic and dumb like, keep riding until you find a better place. The West loves to punish that kind of optimism, so you do the sensible thing, which is not glamorous and will never be painted in an oil portrait. You begin building the first line of defence, a simple barrier, a promise to your own body that you are taking this seriously. And as the north wind presses in, you keep working, because warmth out here is not something you discover. It is something you make. You let your eyes travel over the little wedges again, and you realise something quietly unsettling. This is not a painting. This is not a guess. This is a system. Someone invented a way to trap meaning inside mud, then taught other people how to read it, then used it to run real lives. You picture the process in your hands because it's easier to understand when your body can feel it. A lump of river clay kneaded like dough, flattened into a palm-sized rectangle. A reed cut at an angle, the tip pressed in, lifted, pressed again. The marks are not graceful, but they are efficient. Tiny triangles and lines repeated with the discipline of someone who has deadlines and no patience for artistic flourishes. You are used to writing being light, almost weightless. You tap keys, you swipe screens, you delete mistakes like they never existed. Here, a mistake is a scar. If you press the wrong sign, you either smooth the clay and start over, or you keep going and live with the evidence like a tiny baked confession. It is oddly intimate, like seeing someone's handwriting on an old letter, only this letter is made of earth and stubbornness. A mainstream historical fact settles in with the calm confidence of something archaeologists can actually point at. In early Mesopotamia, writing begins largely as administration. Lists, tallies, rations, deliveries, work assignments. You can almost hear the earliest scribes muttering not about poetry, but about how many jars of oil arrived and whether somebody is lying about the sheep count. Civilization is romantic in hindsight, but in real time, it is mostly inventory. And this is where the reveal feeling comes from. Because once you can record inventory, you can record authority. Once you can record authority, you can record claims. Not just 3 measures of barley, but this field belongs to that temple, and this man owes that debt, and this king is chosen. Clay becomes a memory that does not blink. You imagine the scribal school, the aduba, the tablet house. It is hot. It is crowded. It smells like damp clay and sweat and impatience. A teacher walks between students like a strict guardian of wedge marks. A kid tries to copy a sign and makes it look like a dead insect. The teacher sighs the way teachers have sighed since time began. Here is your first small joke, gentle and true. You complain about your modern handwriting looking like a spider fell into ink, but at least you do not have to bake your homework. The training is serious because the job is serious. A scribe is not just a writer. A scribe is a professional memory. A city runs on what is remembered and what is provable, and the tablet is proof. In a world where voices vanish into air, clay can outlast arguments. You lean into another detail that makes the whole thing feel strangely modern. Identity matters. If a tablet records a deal or a delivery, someone needs to know it is legitimate. That is where seals enter, and they are almost comically stylish for something so ancient. Cylinder seals are small carved stones rolled across wet clay, like a signature that also happens to be a miniature artwork. you can picture the motion. A careful roll, a crisp impression, a tiny scene of gods, animals, heroes, stars, maybe a banquet, maybe a fight. It is both practical and symbolic because it says, "This is mine, and also this is who I am, and sometimes do not mess with me, the gods are watching." Historians still argue whether seals function primarily as administrative ID, social status, display, religious protection, or all of those at once depending on the context. That uncertainty is part of the fun and part of the danger. When you do not have a single agreed meaning, you get a wide open field where later imaginations can build castles. You watch yourself in your mind becoming a little obsessed with the mechanics. Because if you are going to talk about purpose, you need to respect the machine that carries it. A tablet can be a receipt, but it can also be a story, a prayer, a legal contract, an omen, report, a hymn, a letter, or a school exercise. Clay does not care what you put into it. Clay simply holds it. And here is a quirky tidbit that makes you smile in the dark. Sometimes important tablets get sealed inside clay envelopes. Yes, an envelope made of clay, shaped around the tablet, then sealed on the outside. It is like putting your contract inside a locked shell. If someone tampers with it, the envelope breaks and everyone knows. You have modern encryption. They have angry mud. Second joke delivered softly. You think your email security is impressive until you realize ancient Mesopotamia literally invented break glass to read message. You also notice how the medium shapes the message. Clay is durable, but it is not convenient. It wants you to be concise. It wants you to plan. It wants you to think in short lines. If you ramble, your tablet grows and your wrists start filing complaints. This helps explain why so many early records feel clipped and matter of fact. So-and-so received grain. So-and-so delivered fish. Life reduced to essentials. And in those essentials you feel the pulse of a city economy. Temples distribute rations to workers. Storehouses track incoming harvests. Officials count, measure, stamp, verify. A whole civilization becomes legible. You shift closer to the edge where myth begins, because myth is not separate from administration here. The gods are not distant. They are woven into the system. A temple is both a religious space and a warehouse. A festival is both devotion and economics. A king's legitimacy is both divine claim and political strategy. So when later texts speak about divine assemblies, divine decisions, divine orders, it can sound eerily like governance. That resemblance is one reason the Anunnaki idea catches modern ears. People hear bureaucracy and think, a managerial class, and then their imagination adds stars. But you keep your tone sleepy and steady because you are not here to sprint into conclusions. You are here to watch the process, the slow conversion of lived moments into recorded wedges. You picture a scene at dusk. A worker lines up for rations. The official measures barley into a basket. The scribe sits nearby, stylus, ready eye sharp. The worker's name is spoken, then turned into marks. The seal rolls. The transaction becomes permanent. Third joke, light and sleepy. You realise the first influencer economy is just whoever controls the grain and has a really good seal design. Writing changes time. Before writing, memory lives in people, and people forget, die, lie, exaggerate. After writing, memory becomes portable. It becomes storable. It becomes something you can audit. That is why these tablets feel like they reveal things. They are not a rumour, they are a physical trace. Still, even physical traces need interpretation. Signs evolve. Languages shift. A symbol that once meant a thing can later mean a sound or a different thing or several things depending on context. Translators make choices. They argue. They revise. They disagree. A tiny wedge can carry more than one possible reading, and the space between those readings is where debates bloom. Historians still argue whether the earliest writing should be considered a direct representation of spoken language from the start, or whether it begins more as a system of accounting symbols that only gradually becomes full linguistic writing. That debate matters because it reminds you that the tablets are not a single clear window. They are a crafted tool built for specific needs and later repurposed for others. And through all of it, the clay sits quietly, patient as a desert stone. You let the drawer close in your mind, not as an ending, but as a gentle pause. The method is now in your hands. Clay stylus, seal school system. The world learns to remember itself, and once it can remember itself, it can also invent grander stories about who runs the world, why it runs, and what hidden purpose might be stamped into its foundations. You step out of the cool, controlled air of the imagined storeroom and into heat that hits you like a hand on your forehead. Not cruel, just honest. The kind of sun that does not care about your plans. The ground is hard-packed earth and crushed reed. Dust clings to your ankles. The horizon is wide and flat with a faint shimmer where the air trembles. This is what city feels like at the beginning. Not glass towers, not traffic. A dense knot of mud brick houses, courtyards, alleys, workshops, and open spaces where people gather because shade is a valuable currency. You walk as if you belong here because in second person you always belong even when you absolutely should not. The first thing you notice is sound. Not loud but layered. Water sloshing in a canal. A donkey complaining about life, a potter tapping clay, children shouting, then abruptly going quiet when an adult looks at them. Somewhere a singer tries a line and repeats it until it sits right in the throat. You are in Uruk, or something like Uruk, that early giant of southern Mesopotamia, that grows so large it becomes almost mythical even in its own time. A mainstream historical fact settles in by the late 4th millennium BCE. Places like Uruk become some of the world's first true cities, with big populations, specialized labor, and monumental building. Humans learn to live shoulder to shoulder and somehow not collapse into constant fighting, which is honestly impressive for our species. You pass a workshop where someone is weaving and you smell plant fibres and sweat. You pass another where someone is shaping copper and you catch a metallic tang. You pass a brewery courtyard and your nose wakes up. Fermenting grain has a sharp, yeasty smell like bread dough that decided to become louder. Beer here is not a hobby drink. It is food. It is a ration. It is hydration with benefits, and the benefits include not dying of whatever your canal water is doing today. Here's your quirky tidbit for this section, and it always makes modern listeners grin. In Mesopotamia, beer is so normal and so central that you find it in rations and records, and people sometimes drink it through long straws to avoid the chunky bits of grain and fermentation leftovers. You picture a group of workers leaning over a communal jar, each with a straw looking like a very ancient, very serious smoothie bar. First joke, soft and sleepy. You think modern brunch is trendy until you realise people here are basically doing Team Boba minus the pearls plus the existential dread of flood season. You keep walking and you start to feel the shape of a new kind of human life. Everything is organised around the river and the temple and the storage. You see granaries, you see baskets of dates, you see fish drying in the sun, silver and stiff. You see reed bundles stacked like future roofs. You see scribes moving with purpose, because someone has to keep track of all this, and the city's memory is not optional. You drift toward a market area, not a neat grid, but a clustering of people and goods. A man holds up a piece of cloth and shakes it, as if movement makes it more valuable. A woman argues over the weight of a basket. A kid runs past with a small clay toy, nearly colliding with your legs, then vanishes into an alley like a tiny ghost. It is easy to forget when you talk about the Anunnaki that the Sumerians are not living in a myth world. They are living in a practical world full of chores, neighbours' smells, hunger, pride, jealousy, laughter, exhaustion. Myth grows from that soil. You look at the houses. Mud brick walls plastered smooth, small openings for air, courtyards where families cook and talk and sleep when the nights are hot. On rooftops, people might spread mats and lie under stars because the sky here is not a light polluted suggestion. It is a bowl of black velvet with sharp, bright points, and it feels close enough to touch. Second joke, gentle. You try to stargaze in a modern city and mostly see airplanes and disappointment. Here, the universe is basically doing a full performance just for you. The temple rises in the distance, and it changes the mood of your walk. It's not just a building, it is a statement. A ziggurat-like platform or an earlier form of monumental structure built because someone decided the divine deserves height and visibility. It is a focal point for belief, for power, for storage, for festivals, for legitimacy. You can feel why gods become administrative in this place. When your survival depends on coordinated labour, on irrigation schedules, on shared storage, on leadership that can mobilise workers. The idea of cosmic managers makes emotional sense. You want the universe to have structure because your city does. Now you pass a group of men carrying baskets of mud, and you imagine the labour behind every wall. Everything here is built by hands. Even the concept of purpose is built by hands. People speak it into existence, repeat it, carve it into clay, teach it to children. And yet, this is where one of the big scholarly tensions appears. Even if you do not say it out loud like a lecture, historians still argue whether the explosive growth of early Mesopotamian cities is driven primarily by environmental opportunity and irrigation by trade and craft specialization by social hierarchy and coercion, or by a complex mix of all three that refuses to sit neatly in one explanation. You feel that debate in the air because the city itself feels like a balancing act. On one side, cooperation, on the other, control. Who decides who gets the beer ration? Who decides who works where? Who decides what the gods want? You drift closer to a scribal space, not a formal classroom necessarily, but a place where tablets are made and stacked. Someone is pressing signs into clay with quick practice motions. Another person is reading a tablet aloud, the words sounding like a rhythm of consonants and vowels that your tongue cannot quite hold. You lean in and you see a tablet that is not mythic at all. It is painfully practical. A list of workers maybe, a delivery record, a tally of jars. And you realize something important for the theme of true purpose. The Sumerians are not writing because they are trying to hide secrets for you to decode thousands of years later. They are writing because they have problems that require tracking and proof. But humans are never only practical. In the same city you can find hymns, stories, laments, prayers. You can find a king commissioning a text to praise himself and his gods. You can find a priest reciting lines that make the world feel ordered. You turn toward a small shrine where someone has placed offerings, maybe bread, maybe a bit of oil, maybe a tiny figurine. The act is simple, but the feeling is huge. The person is trying to stay on good terms with forces they cannot control. This is where the idea of the Anunnaki's purpose becomes tempting. Because if you believe the gods are real actors in your world, then their purpose matters. Their moods matter, their decisions matter. And if you are a modern reader with a taste for mystery, you start asking, what if the gods are described the way they are because they were something else? The fringe tidbit of the night is not a specific claim, but a pattern you notice when people see ancient descriptions of shining beings descending from the sky, granting knowledge, demanding offerings, organizing kingship. Modern imaginations often reinterpret those motifs as evidence of visitors or outsiders with superior technology. It is a common modern lens, and it thrives because it makes myth feel like a coded report. Third joke, soft. You realize humans can look at any ancient story and somehow translate it into aliens. Did it the same way you can look at any leftover food and somehow call it meal prep. Still, you do not dismiss the pull. You respect it. The city itself is astonishing. The writing is astonishing. The organization is astonishing. The urge to explain, that astonishment is human. You walk to the edge of the canal and you watch water move slowly, carrying bits of reed reflecting the sun. You imagine a scribe looking at this same water and thinking of the god who owns it. You imagine a king thinking of the god who grants him authority. You imagine a worker thinking of the god who decides whether the harvest comes. And in that layered, ordinary, exhausting life, the divine becomes a kind of explanation engine. The Anunnaki, whatever they are in the texts, belong to that engine. They are part of the framework a city uses to understand itself and justify itself. You let the sun sink a little lower in your mind, and the air becomes just slightly kinder. The city breathes. The temple casts a long shadow. Somewhere someone presses wedges into clay, turning another day into a record. Purpose, you realize, is not a single secret hidden in one tablet. Purpose is the story a civilization tells itself, so it can keep building keep obeying, keep hoping, keep enduring. You drift closer to the temple complex as evening thickens the air and the city's noise softens into a lower register. Fires begin to glow in courtyards. The scent of roasting grain and warm oil curls through alleys. Somewhere a priest's chant rises and falls like the tide, steady enough to make your eyelids heavier even while your mind stays curious. At the temple entrance, you pause because this is where the universe gets organized. Not in the way you might expect. Not with lightning bolts and dramatic clouds. It is organized the way a city organizes itself, with roles, responsibilities, hierarchies, and a lot of implied consequences if you mess it up. You step inside a courtyard where offerings sit in neat arrangements: bread, beer, dates. Maybe a small animal, maybe a bowl of oil reflecting the last light. The people moving through the space are calm but purposeful. They do not behave like they are visiting a museum. They behave like they are reporting to work because for many of them, that is exactly what this is. A temple is not only a place of worship. It is a place of administration, storage, and planning. A mainstream historical fact settles into place like a brick in a wall. In early Mesopotamia, each major city tends to be closely associated with a patron deity, and temples function as major institutional centers that manage land, labor, and resources. The gods are not just prayed to, they are woven into the civic system because the temple is one of the main engines of the city's economy. You look around and you can almost see it as an invisible diagram above everyone's head, a divine org chart. At the top of that chart is the sky itself, because the sky is the biggest thing you can point to. Anu, the high god of the heavens, feels like the title chairman of the board. Not always the one handling daily operations, but the one whose existence legitimizes the whole structure. If your city needs cosmic authority, you start with the sky. Then you feel the wind and the storm, and you understand why Enlil matters. Enlil is often imagined as a powerful force of air storm command. In a land where weather and river behavior can decide your fate, the god who orders the world starts to look like the universe's executive manager, the kind who does not smile much, the kind who signs decisions that make everyone else nervous. Then there is Enki, also called Aa in later traditions, and he changes the mood completely. Water, wisdom, craft, cleverness, the subterranean fresh water that people imagine beneath the earth. You picture him less as a thunder god and more as a problem solver, a strategist, a creative engineer. In a city that lives by canals, a water and wisdom god is not a poetic flourish. He is a survival concept. Your first light joke arrives, and you let it land softly. If the pantheon is a company, Anu is the founder who rarely shows up. Enlil is the intense CEO. And Enki is the brilliant person in the back room keeping everything from exploding. But the chart does not stop there, because humans do not stop at simple. The moon is not a decoration. It measures time. It shapes rituals. It lights night travel. So the moon god, often called Nana or Sin, becomes a keeper of cycles. You can feel how comforting that is. In a chaotic world, a steady cycle is a promise. The sun is a judge, not because it feels moral, but because it sees everything. The sun god Utu, also called Shamash in later contexts, becomes associated with justice, truth and law. You almost smile at how practical the symbolism is. The sun crosses the sky and touches every rooftop, every alley, every secret meeting. If you want a divine witness, choose the sun. Then the city's heartbeat, its desire, its pride, its hunger for beauty and power, turns into a deity with a sharp grin. Inanna, later Ishtar, is love, war, fertility, politics, ambition, charisma. She feels like the force that makes humans do reckless things while calling it destiny. You can imagine her temple buzzing with a different energy than the others. More perfume, more music, more tension. Second joke, gentle and sleepy. Inanna feels like the divine version of a notification you cannot ignore. Seductive, dramatic, and somehow always arriving at the worst possible time. You keep mapping and you realize the pantheon is not just cosmic. It is local and specific. A city may honor certain gods more intensely because those gods fit the city's identity, its economy, its landscape, its rivals. The gods are not only above people, they are also between people, woven into alliances and conflicts. This is where the pantheon starts to resemble bureaucracy in the deepest sense. Not boring paperwork, but the fundamental idea that reality is managed, divided, assigned. And then you hear someone speak a word with special care as if they are touching a fragile tool, the me. In some Sumerian stories, the me are divine powers, ordinances, attributes, the essential rules and cultural technologies that make civilization function. Kingship, craftsmanship, wisdom, music, law, even things like heroic behaviour. They are not random gifts. They are like files in a cosmic archive, permissions granted by the gods that allow society to operate in a certain way. Here is your quirky tidbit, and it is deliciously strange. There are myths where these me are treated almost like transferable items, things that can be held, moved, even stolen. A story can describe a deity acquiring the me and thereby acquiring the authority to shape civilization. It is myth, yes, but it is also a striking metaphor. Culture becomes a set of granted functions, like divine software licenses. Third joke, softly delivered. You realise the first fear of every ancient civilization is not a monster, it is losing access to its premium features. You stand in the courtyard and let the implications settle. If divine powers are treated like administrative tokens, then the gods are not just emotional comforts, they are managers of the world's operating system. And once you frame it that way, you understand why people later look at this and feel the pull of an alternate interpretation. If it sounds like management, maybe it was management, but you also feel the other side of the truth. Humans naturally describe the unknown using the most complex system they understand. In a city-state world driven by temples, councils, rations, and authority, the cosmos will be imagined as a larger version of the same. Historians still argue whether Mesopotamian myths should be read primarily as reflections of social and political realities like rival city-states and shifting priestly power, or as independent religious visions that shape society rather than simply mirror it. That debate matters because it changes how you interpret every divine decision? Is it a cosmic event, or is it a theological way of talking about who gets to rule? You watch temple workers move with careful rhythm. Some carry offerings, some record distributions, some maintain the space sweeping, arranging, guarding. It feels almost modern the way institutions reproduce themselves through routine. And you notice another subtle thing. The gods in these stories are not perfect. They argue. They compete. They make choices that seem petty or strategic or emotional. They feast. They demand attention. That imperfection is not a flaw in the system. It is the system, because a pantheon is a mirror of a society that understands power as negotiation. You let the night deepen. Stars begin to sharpen above the temple roofline. The city quiets into pockets of conversation and distant laughter. The divine feels close, not because it is physically present, but because the city is built to keep it present in language, in ritual, in daily management. And as you stand there, you sense the core of what makes these tablets feel so provocative. The gods are not only stories about nature, they are stories about control authority and the fragile machinery of civilization. When you hear about beings who allocate powers, assign kingship, oversee labour, and manage fate, the word purpose starts to hum in your mind like a low fan in a dark room. You stand at the edge of a quiet room where language becomes a trap, not because it is evil, but because it is old. A single word can look simple, even friendly, until you realise it has travelled through centuries, swapped outfits, and learn how to smile differently depending on who is speaking. That word is Anunnaki. You let it sit in your mouth like a dry date pit. It is sharp, unfamiliar, and it makes your brain do what brains always do. It tries to grab something modern to hold on to, a neat definition, a single picture, a tidy cast list. But the word does not cooperate. In the earliest Sumerian material, you often meet something closer to Anuna or Anuna, a group term tied to the high god Anu, the sky authority whose name alone carries weight. The ending can shift, the spelling can shift, the sense can shift. You are not dealing with one fixed logo. You are dealing with a category that behaves the way categories behave in real human life. Fuzzy at the edges, clear only when the context pins it down. Here is a mainstream historical fact that grounds you before imagination runs wild. In Mesopotamian religion, Anunnaki is generally used for a group of deities, not a single being. And different texts place them in different roles, sometimes as major gods in assembly, sometimes as underworld figures involved in judgment. The word belongs to theology and mythic structure long before it belongs to modern cosmic speculation. You notice how quickly your mind wants to argue with that, not because it is wrong, but because it is unsatisfying. A group of gods sounds normal. Too normal. Your curiosity wants sharper teeth, so you do what a careful reader does. You watch how the term behaves. In some contexts, Anunnaki feels like an honour roll of high-status divine figures, the sort of beings who belong in the biggest decisions. In other contexts, the word sinks downward into darker spaces, underworld associations, chthonic authority, a sense of solemn, heavy responsibility. It is not always glamorous. Sometimes it is the divine version of sitting through a long court proceeding. First joke, soft and sleepy. You wanted cosmic adventure, but the ancient text hands you a committee meeting, and somehow the committee meeting is eternal. This shift is not a mistake. It is a clue. Words in ancient traditions often travel through time the way rivers travel through land. They change course. They pick up silt. They carve new meanings. The city-states that first speak them rise, fall, merge, get conquered, get reinterpreted. Languages evolve. Sumerian remains as a learned language, even when Akkadian becomes dominant in many places, and scribes keep copying, translating, adapting. A term can live multiple lives at once. You picture a scribe reading an older Sumerian line, then shaping it into Akkadian, understanding, then someone else later reading the Akkadian line and assuming it has always meant exactly that. The chain is not dishonest. It is human. Historians still argue whether the Anunnaki were originally conceived mainly as heavenly gods of Anu, as earth-linked divine authorities, or as underworld judges, with the answer possibly depending on region, time period, and the specific literary tradition involved. That debate matters because it means you cannot grab one role and declare it the true one for all tablets, all centuries, all audiences. You start seeing the Anunnaki less as a single secret and more as a label that groups divine power. And labels are powerful because they simplify. A civilization needs ways to talk about complexity without drowning in it. You cannot list every god every time you describe a cosmic decision. You use group terms. You say the great gods. You say the assembly. You say those who decree fate. You say Anunnaki, and your listener understands, at least in that moment, that you mean a certain class of beings who carry weight. Second joke, gentle. It is basically the ancient equivalent of saying upper management and watching everyone immediately become quiet and polite. You also notice something else. The Anunnaki do not arrive in a vacuum. They arrive in stories that already have systems roles, authority and anxiety. Their function is to help explain why the world feels governed, why kingship feels sanctioned, why law feels backed by more than human muscle. So when modern people ask what is their true purpose, your first honest answer is that the texts do not treat them like a riddle box. They treat them like a category of divine power that supports the structure of reality as people imagine it. But then because you are human and curious, you follow the twist that modern imagination loves. Modern readers often stumble because the word sounds exotic and clean, and it is easy to project clarity onto it. People also love a single villain or a single mastermind. A group term frustrates that desire, so the group gets reshaped into a single storyline, and the storyline gets sharpened into a claim, and the claim becomes a certainty that travels faster than nuance ever will. Here's your quirky fringe tidbit presented like a strange object you pick up and examine under low light. In the 20th century, popular alternative interpretations famously, including those associated with Zecharia Sitchin, recast the Anunnaki as extraterrestrial visitors with a concrete agenda, reading certain mythic lines as literal accounts of space travel and engineered humanity. The idea spreads because it is dramatic, because it offers a single plot, and because it makes ancient complexity feel like a coded report waiting for a modern decoder. You do not have to accept that reading to understand its appeal. It offers modern minds what they crave: a straight line, a motive, a purpose. But the clay world does not run on straight lines. It runs on layered storytelling. So you test the modern claim against the ancient habit of language. If a text uses a group term for gods, does it automatically mean a single coherent faction with one unified plan? Not necessarily. Ancient pantheons are messy. Divine beings compete, negotiate, collaborate, feud. Even when they gather, they do not always agree. A group can mean an assembly, not an army. Third joke. Quiet and kind. You want a sleek sci-fi team with matching uniforms, but the ancient gods behave more like a family group chat, where half the members are muted and the drama still leaks through. You lean closer to what misunderstanding looks like in practice. One misunderstanding is assuming a word keeps the same meaning across time. Another is assuming translation is a simple swap, like exchanging coins. Another is treating mythic language as if it is always literal or always symbolic, instead of letting it be what it often is: a mix that changes depending on the storyteller's goal. Sometimes a line about gods descending is poetic. Sometimes it is ritual language. Sometimes it is political theatre. Sometimes it is a way to say, this authority is higher than you, so obey. If you turn every descent into a spaceship landing, you may gain a thrilling image, but you also risk losing the local meaning the original audience felt in their bones. You also notice how modern habits make the problem worse. Modern minds love capitalize, some proper nouns that act like brands. Anunnaki becomes a brand, a single thing, a searchable term, a label that feels like it should yield one definitive Wikipedia-style paragraph. Ancient minds are more comfortable with overlapping identities. A deity can have multiple names, titles, functions. A group can shift its membership depending on the story. So you treat Anunnaki as a living category, not a fixed creature. You picture an assembly scene, solemn and crowded, where divine beings gather to authorize a decision. The word Anunnaki might be used to evoke the weight of that gathering. Not a census of specific individuals, but a sense of legitimacy. If you hear it, you feel the room's gravity increase. Then you picture a darker scene, an underworld courtroom, where judgment must be made, and the same group term can carry that same gravity into a different space. The category travels because the power travels. And now the word purpose begins to look less like a hidden mission statement and more like a function. The Anunnaki in the ancient framework help enforce cosmic order. They help make authority feel real. They help turn human governance into something that looks divinely backed. You breathe out slowly. The room stays dim. The fan hum stays steady. The ancient word sits where it belongs, not as a single answer, but as a signpost pointing to how a civilization groups and narrates power. You leave the word Anunnaki resting where it belongs, like a heavy stone that does not need polishing, and you follow a different thread, one that feels almost too bold for the human voice. Kingship descends from heaven. You hear it like a phrase spoken in a temple courtyard. calm, unquestioned, the way people say the sun rises, even though technically that is not what is happening. The phrase is not trying to be poetic for your benefit. It is trying to establish a reality, a rule, a foundation, because in the earlier city-states, power is not obvious. It must be justified. It must be narrated. You cannot simply say, I am king because I am stronger, not if you want stability. You need people to believe that your authority fits the world's design. So you step into the strange comfort of the Sumerian king list, that famous catalogue of rulers and reigns that reads like history wearing a ceremonial robe. You can feel the tablet voice shifting into a formal tone, like a clerk reading out names in a sacred registry. A mainstream historical fact anchors you gently. The Sumerian king list is a real ancient text that lists dynasties and kings across different cities, mixing historical figures with legendary ones, and it was copied in multiple versions over time. It is not a simple record, it is a political and cultural document shaped by its purpose. And the purpose is the point. It does something clever. It takes messy, competing city histories and threads them into a single narrative of legitimacy. It says kingship is one thing, one institution, moving from city to city like a torch passed by the gods. Not seized, not stolen, not debated, but granted and transferred. You can almost hear the sigh of relief from anyone living in chaos. If kingship is granted from above, then the world has order. If the world has order, then your anxiety has a ceiling. Not a perfect ceiling, but something. Then you run into the part that makes modern readers sit up even while trying to fall asleep. The reign lengths. Some are absurdly long, stretching into thousands and tens of thousands of years. Your modern brain reacts like it just saw a receipt for a sandwich that costs $1 million. First joke, soft and sleepy. You complain about your work meeting lasting an hour, and these early kings are allegedly ruling longer than your entire species has had indoor plumbing. The long reigns are not just random, they are part of the text's tone. They signal a time that is not like your time, an era when the world is closer to the divine, when boundaries are looser, when mythic scale is normal. They set a dramatic contrast with later reigns that become shorter and more realistic, as if the world is slowly settling into a more human rhythm. Historians still argue whether the earliest fantastical reign lengths reflect symbolic numerology, scribal tradition, deliberate myth-making to elevate certain dynasties or remnants of older time count systems that got reinterpreted. That debate matters because it changes the feel of the list. Is it a theological statement, a political claim, or an echo of lost accounting methods? You let that uncertainty stay open because tonight is not about forcing a single answer. It is about noticing how the text performs. You move through the list like walking through a hall of portraits. Names, cities, dynasties. The torch of kingship shifts. Kish Uruk-ur and others take turns as centres of power. The list creates a rhythm. Rise, rule, transfer. Rise, rule, transfer. And underneath that rhythm is a message that feels like it's aimed at the living, not the dead. It says power is legitimate when it fits the divine story. Now, because you are here to explore the Anunnaki's purpose, You pay attention to how this concept of kingship connects to divine assemblies. When kingship is said to descend from heaven, it implies a heavenly decision, a granting, a decree. Somewhere in the imagination of the culture, divine beings have gathered and agreed this city, this king, this era. You do not need to name the Anunnaki directly for them to hover near this concept, because they belong to the class of beings that represent divine authority. The great gods, the deciding powers, the ones whose approval makes a crown feel heavier than gold. You step into a scene in your mind where a king is presented not simply as a military leader, but as a mediator between city and cosmos. The king's job is not just to command, it is to maintain favour, to fund temples, to lead rituals, to protect order, to make the city feel aligned with divine intention. That alignment is the heartbeat of legitimacy. Second joke, gentle. You realise early kingship is basically the original verified badge, except if you lose it, you do not get shadow banned, you get conquered. And then you come to a different layer. The king list is also a way to stitch together memory after disruption. Floods, wars, shifts in power, migrations, collapsing alliances. The list smooths chaos into narrative. It is the ancient version of saying, yes, things were messy, but the overall system is still intact. This is where the flood enters not as a separate dramatic tale yet, but as a structural hinge. The king list includes a division between kingship before the flood and after the flood, a reset line, a cosmic punctuation mark. You can feel why that reset matters. A flood is both literal and mythic in Mesopotamia. Rivers flood. They destroy. They also fertilize. Water is both life and threat. So a flood becomes the perfect symbol for wiping a slate and beginning again with divine permission. Your quirky tidbit slides in here like a small gleaming coin. Many Mesopotamian texts love numbers and patterns, and the king list's huge reigns often align with a fascination for sexagesimal thinking, the base and 60 style that shows up in their math. Even if you do not pin down exact numerical intention, you can sense a cultural comfort with large structured numbers as markers of cosmic importance. Third joke, softly. You thought your phone battery percentage controlled your mood, but ancient scribes are out here using entire number systems to control destiny. You walk back into the political reality beneath the mythic phrasing. City-states compete. Each wants to be seen as legitimate, ancient, blessed. A text that places your city in the line of divinely sanctioned kingship is not neutral. It is a claim. It is propaganda with religious perfume. That does not make it fake. It makes it functional. And when you ask, what is the purpose of the Anunnaki, you begin to see a clearer shape forming. Within this worldview, the divine assembly, whether named or implied, exists to authorize order, to justify hierarchy, to make human power feel like a piece of cosmic architecture rather than a messy human bargain. So kingship descending from heaven is not just a poetic line. It is a mechanism, a way of binding society to a story so strong that people obey it even when they are tired, hungry and suspicious. The night deepens. The city's fires flicker. Somewhere a scribe presses a fresh line into clay, and the idea of authority becomes permanent, again sealed not only by a king's name, but by the implied approval of beings who exist above argument. You wander into a quieter kind of power, not the kind that wears a crown, but the kind that edits the universe with words. It is late enough that the city has softened. The heat holds on, but it is less aggressive, like it has finally decided to stop showing off. In a temple side room, lamps burn with a steady yellow glow. Shadows tremble on plaster walls. The air smells like oil and warm clay, and also that faint human smell of people who have been indoors all day doing serious thinking. This is the workshop where creation myths live, not carved into mountains, not shouted by thunder, written, copied, recited, adjusted, argued over, then written again. A creation story is supposed to feel eternal, but the way it survives is deeply practical. Someone has to keep it alive. Someone has to decide which version gets copied. Someone has to decide which god gets the best lines. You watch a scribe settle at a low table. He wets clay, smooths it, and tests his stylus tip with the concentration of someone preparing to do surgery on language. Another man, older, begins reciting a text in a measured cadence, letting the words float through the room like incense. The scribe listens, then presses the sound into wedges. A mainstream historical fact slides in gently. Mesopotamian creation stories exist in multiple traditions and languages, and later Babylonian texts like the Enuma Elish become especially influential, preserved on tablets and associated with ritual performance, including festivals where the story reinforces cosmic order and political authority. You feel the reason for that right away. A creation myth does not only explain how the world began, it explains how the world should be run. In the dim room, the myth is not entertainment, it is infrastructure. You lean closer and you sense the shape of a familiar pattern. At the start, there is not a neat day one. There is a before, a formless time, a mingling, a watery vastness, the kind of opening that makes you feel small and sleepy, like staring into a dark ocean at night. Then things begin to separate. Sky from earth, order from swirl, roles assigned, powers named. The world becomes legible. And because humans love a good hierarchy, the myth often builds toward a moment where one deity rises above the rest, not merely by existing, but by proving they can handle responsibility. They solve a crisis. They defeat chaos. They earn titles. They become the one who decrees the one whose word shapes reality. First joke quiet. You realize even the cosmos has a hiring process. And the interview question is basically, can you manage chaos without crying? You notice how these stories behave like living documents. They are not frozen. They adapt to cities, to politics, to which temple is currently thriving, to which dynasty needs cosmic backing. A city that wants legitimacy wants its patron god to look important. And stories are one of the safest ways to do that, because you can claim calmly that the universe itself agrees with you. In one tradition, the focus may rest on an older set of divine figures, a more Sumerian flavour, where gods feel close to landscape, water, fertility, and the rhythms of life. In another, the story shifts and a newer political centre elevates its own deity. The skeleton of creation stays recognisable, but the spotlight moves. This is where you sense the editing in a way that feels almost modern. Not evil editing, just human editing. The kind where someone says, "This part is good, keep it," and then quietly adds, "Also our God needs a stronger entrance." Historians still argue whether major creation epics like the Enuma Elish should be understood primarily as theological reflection, as political propaganda to elevate particular city gods, or as a blend where religion and statecraft are inseparable. The debate stays open because the text can do multiple jobs at once, like a song that is both beautiful and also a national anthem. You sit with that thought and the room feels even more intimate. These are not only myths about the first dawn, they are myths about who gets to rule now. The scribe writes about divine assemblies, about powers that gather to decide fate. You hear the language of authority again. You can feel why a term like Anunnaki becomes meaningful in this environment, because the story needs a group that represents weight-sanctioned legitimacy. A myth does not want you thinking the world is random. It wants you thinking the world is governed. Second joke soft. You came for bedtime and the ancient world hands you a cosmic rulebook, because apparently even sleep needs regulations. Your mind drifts to the most famous dramatic creation pattern in the region. The story where a champion god confronts a vast embodiment of chaos, often imagined as primal waters, and through that victory the cosmos is arranged into something stable. It is not gore, it is mythic force, a symbolic wrestling match between disorder and structure. In later Babylonian framing, the champion is Marduk, whose rise mirrors Babylon's rise, and the story can feel like the universe itself endorsing the city's dominance. The chaos figure, often associated with Tiamat, represents a primal, unshaped power that must be organized. The result is a world where stations are assigned, heavenly bodies follow paths, temples mirror cosmic order, and humans appear not as the centre of romance, but as part of a system. Now you bump into a line of thought that keeps modern imaginations awake, even when they pretend to be sleepy. Why do humans show up in some myths as workers, as servants of the gods, as beings created to take over labour that divine beings do not want to do anymore? This is where purpose begins to thrum again, low and steady. Because if a myth says humans are made to work, then divine purpose looks less like love and more like management, less like spiritual poetry and more like logistics. The gods want temples maintained, offerings delivered, order upheld. Humans become the hands that keep the machine running. Your quirky tidbit arrives on bare feet, trying not to wake anyone. Many ancient Mesopotamian texts were copied as part of scribal education, and some tablets include notes and colophons that show they belong to a series, or that they were checked, or that they were copied from an older source. It is the ancient version of version control, except the commit message is basically copied carefully. Please, do not blame me if the original was messy. Third joke, gentle. You imagine an ancient scribe whispering, "If this line makes no sense, that is on the previous guy," and honestly, you respect the professionalism. Now the fringe itch comes in and you acknowledge it without letting it steer the whole room. Modern fringe interpretations sometimes treat these creation texts like literal technical reports, The primeval waters become a cosmic medium. The divine assembly becomes a council of non-human planners. The making of humans for labour becomes genetic engineering. The assigning of destinies becomes programming. It is a tempting translation for modern minds trained to see systems everywhere. But you also feel how dangerous that can be, because myth speaks in layered language. It compresses social reality, environmental fear, political ambition, ritual, rhythm, and genuine spiritual awe into one story. If you flatten it into literal engineering, you may gain a thrilling narrative, but you lose the original texture, the way a lullaby becomes meaningless if you treat it like a spreadsheet. Still, you keep the main question alive by staying close to function. In these myths, the divine does not simply exist. The divine organizes. It assigns roles. It establishes order. It legitimizes hierarchy. It makes it emotionally possible for a crowded city to accept its own structure. And in the lamplight, you realize something quietly important. Creation myths are not only about the past, they are about the present. They tell you in soothing cosmic language why the temple matters, why the king matters, why the gods deserve offerings, why your work is not meaningless, why the sky is not just a ceiling of indifferent stars. You let the room settle into silence again. The scribe's stylus pauses. The lamp flickers. Outside, the city exhales. The myth remains not as a single fixed scripture, but as a carefully maintained craft, a living script that keeps getting retold, so the world keeps feeling held together. You walk toward a city that feels older than its own walls. Eridu sits low against the flat land, close to the watery edge, where reeds whisper and insects do their nightly violin practice. The air is damp in a way the inland streets are not. Here, water is not just a canal you manage. It is a presence, a mood, a neighbour that can be generous or furious, depending on what the season decides. You move through narrow paths between mud brick structures and small courtyards, and you feel a particular kind of pride in the place. Eridu is often treated in the cultural imagination as one of the earliest cities, a kind of ancestral home where order begins. It has that first chapter aura, except nobody is calling it a chapter because you are simply walking forward into it like you belong. A mainstream historical fact settles in with the calm weight of excavated earth. Eridu is one of the most ancient and important sites in southern Mesopotamia, strongly associated with the god Enki, and its long occupation makes it a key place for understanding early temple building and early urban religious life. You feel that association immediately because everything here smells faintly of water, reed and craft. You find a small shrine space, and you picture Enki as the kind of deity who does not just command but invents, the god of the subterranean freshwater wisdom and skill, the one who knows how the world works under the surface. In a landscape where the surface can crack and turn to dust, the idea of hidden fresh water is not just spiritual, it is comfort. Then you hear another word drifting through the air of later myth and scholarly talk, a word that sounds like it belongs to a secret society. Apkallu. They are described in tradition as sages, wise beings, connected to the deep, to knowledge, to the transmission of civilization. In some tellings, They are linked to a primeval era, and in some imagery they are shown wearing fish skins or fish cloaks, as if they have stepped out of water and decided to dress like their origin. The image sticks to your brain because it is so specific. A robed figure, human-shaped but crowned, with a head of a fish, scales, draped down the back like a hood. Not cute, not exactly horrifying, just confidently strange. First joke, soft and sleepy. You spend 20 minutes choosing an outfit, and these ancient sages are out here wearing full fish couture like it is the most normal thing in the world. You let the image hover and you ask gently what it is doing. A culture that lives by rivers and canals will naturally make wisdom watery. Knowledge flows, skills are transmitted, life depends on managing water. So the sages that bring civilization arrive wearing the symbol of what keeps civilization alive. And yet, the image also invites modern imagination to sprint. Fish-cloaked visitors who teach humans the arts of civilization. You can already hear the modern voice whispering, "That sounds like outsiders." You can feel the temptation to interpret them as something non-human, something arriving with advanced instruction. This is where you stay calm and curious at the same time. Historians still argue whether the Apkallu tradition reflects purely mythic symbolism about wisdom and priestly legitimacy, or whether it preserves echoes of real cultural memory, such as contact with skilled outsiders, prestige knowledge, networks, or elite claims of special origin. The debate remains open because myth can be both metaphor and memory, and the line between them is rarely labelled for your convenience. You wander closer to a temple foundation and you imagine a priest explaining that these sages are not aliens, not tourists, but part of the sacred history that makes the temple meaningful. If you can claim that your rituals descend from primeval sages, you gain authority. If you can link your priesthood to ancient wisdom, you become harder to challenge. Wisdom becomes lineage. Second joke, gentle. You realise I learnt this from an ancient master is the oldest marketing strategy on earth, and it still works on you when someone says it in a calming voice. Now your mind drifts to the most famous name tied to these sages, the one that keeps surfacing in later Mesopotamian tradition like a boy, Oannes, a figure described in later accounts as a being who emerges from the sea, teaches humans writing, arts, law, agriculture, and then returns to the water. Whether you treat that as a late retelling, a transformed myth, or an outsider's summary, it carries the same theme. Civilization arrives as a gift delivered by a strange teacher who is not quite like ordinary people. This is your quirky tidbit, and it makes the whole night feel slightly more dreamlike. In Mesopotamian iconography, you sometimes see figures associated with ritual purification, holding buckets and sprinklers, wearing fish skins or feathered garments, performing protective acts. The look is part priest, part symbol, part performance. In a world without a clear boundary between ritual and reality, costume becomes theology you can see. You watch one such figure in your mind, moving through a courtyard with careful steps, sprinkling water, murmuring words that are both prayer and protocol. The action is soothing. It says the world can be cleaned. The world can be reset. The unseen can be managed. Third joke softly. You are out here trying to cleanse your mind with sleep, and ancient priests are basically doing the same thing with a bucket and a fish hoodie. Now, because you are here for the Anunnaki question, you pay attention to how this Apkallu motif fits into the larger structure of divine purpose. The Anunnaki in many traditions represent a class of divine authority. The Apkallu represent a different function, the transmission of civilization. They are about knowledge, arriving skills, being handed over the human world, being upgraded. They are the bridge between the divine realm and the daily realm, between cosmic order and the bread you actually eat. And this is exactly where modern fringe readings become bold. Some modern interpretations treat the Apkallu as evidence that the ancients remembered real teachers who were not human beings who arrived from somewhere else and brought structured knowledge. In that framing, the fish imagery becomes a suit, a symbol of aquatic origin, or a misunderstood description of something technological. The temple becomes a landing site in disguise. The priesthood becomes a maintenance crew for inherited rituals. The gift of civilization becomes a planned program. You hold that idea in your hands like a polished stone. It is smooth. It is satisfying. It makes everything connect neatly. Then you look back at the messiness of real human culture and you notice how often humans personify ideas. Wisdom becomes a person. Civilization becomes a set of gifts. Knowledge becomes a teacher. And water, the most important element in your environment, becomes the costume and the origin story. So you do not accept or reject too quickly. You simply observe the pattern. A city like Eridu claims deep antiquity and deep sacredness. A god like Enki embodies cleverness and the life-giving deep. A tradition like the Apkallu gives a narrative for how humans get from chaos to order. It is a story that says, we did not invent everything alone. We received it. That story can be spiritual humility, political strategy, or both. You stand near the edge of a canal and watch the surface catch moonlight. The water moves slowly, carrying tiny ripples that look like writing you cannot quite read. You imagine the first person who ever stood here and felt the same quiet awe. They looked at water and saw mystery. They looked at the skill of building canals and saw something almost miraculous. They looked at writing and felt it was too powerful to be ordinary. So they made a story where wisdom comes from the deep, wearing the deep. And in that story, the purpose of higher beings is not only to rule, but to teach, to organize, to grant the tools of civilization in a way that feels sanctioned by the cosmos. You let your shoulders relax. The night air is softer here. The city is quieter. The idea of sages emerging from water becomes less like a puzzle you must solve and more like a lullaby the culture tells itself. A lullaby that says you are not alone. Someone older brought you these skills. Someone in the deep knows what they are doing. Whether that someone is myth, memory, metaphor, or something stranger, the story does what it has always done. It makes the world feel guided. You find yourself in a story space that feels less like poetry and more like a complaint filed with the universe. It begins with work. Not the romantic kind of work where you sip tea and feel productive. The blunt kind, digging, hauling, building, dredging canals, carrying baskets of mud, until your shoulders become two separate people who hate you. In Mesopotamian imagination, even the gods have to deal with this problem, because a world with rivers and fields and cities does not run itself. You stand in a dim ritual room where the air smells like oil smoke and damp clay. A voice recites lines that describe divine beings doing labour not as a metaphor you politely ignore, but as a central tension. The divine realm is not only a shining palace, it is also a work site, and the work site is loud with exhaustion. A mainstream historical fact slides in gently like a tablet set down on a table without drama. In the Atrahasis epic, a well-known Mesopotamian narrative preserved on tablets, the lesser gods are burdened with labour. They grow angry, and the solution involves creating humans to take over the work, leading to consequences that echo through later flood traditions. The details vary across versions and time, but the core idea is startlingly consistent. Humans exist in part to keep the system running. You blink slowly because that is the kind of origin story that does not come with a free motivational poster. The reciter describes the divine workers as fed up, tired, and increasingly bold about it. They have been digging canals and carrying loads, doing the heavy lifting of world building. At some point, the resentment hits a boil. They protest. They threaten. In some tellings, they surround the house of a higher god with torches in the night, like an ancient labour strike wrapped in myth. First joke, soft and sleepy, you complain about your job, and then you realise even the gods are out here saying, we need better conditions, which is honestly validating. You let the scene form around you. The great gods, the decision makers, gather. The atmosphere is heavy, not because they are evil, but because they are managers of a reality that requires constant maintenance. The world is not a toy. It is an irrigation system with moods. Someone proposes a solution that feels both ingenious and unsettling. Create a new being, something that can work. Something that can carry loads, 10 fields, maintain temples, and make offerings, a being that can absorb the labour and leave the higher powers free to do what higher powers claim they must do. This is where purpose becomes sharp enough to cut, because in this mythic logic, purpose is not abstract meaning. Purpose is assignment. A role created to fill a need. You watch the act of creation take shape. It is not a clean sci-fi lab scene. It is muddy, literal clay. A goddess associated with birth and making, often Ninhursag, or a similar mother figure, depending on the version, is called in to shape the new beings. Enki, the clever water and wisdom god, is involved too, because complicated projects always require someone who knows how to make a plan work in practice. Then you meet the detail that makes modern listeners sit up, then slowly lie back down while still staring at the ceiling. A quirky tidbit with a fringe flavour arrives, and it is strange enough to be memorable. Some versions describe humans being formed from clay mixed with the blood or essence of a slain god. A divine sacrifice becomes an ingredient, like the universe adding a drop of authority into the recipe, so the new beings will be more than mud with legs. It is mythic chemistry thick with symbolism, and also the kind of detail that modern interpreters love to treat as literal procedure. Second joke, gentle. You thought your family recipes were intense. And then ancient Mesopotamia hands you add clay, add divine essence, stir until civilization appears. In the room, the reciter does not wink at you and say, "This is symbolic." The story does not need to explain itself. It expects you to understand that creation is a serious business, and serious business requires costly materials. In a world where blood is life, using blood to animate clay makes intuitive mythic sense. It says humans are tied to the gods, not only as servants, but as beings carrying a fragment of the divine order inside them. Now the tension deepens because the solution is not purely kind. Humans are created to work, yes, but that also means humans are born into obligation. The myth makes it feel normal. It frames labour as the default condition of existence. You work because the world needs work. You serve because the system depends on service. If you listen closely, you can hear a city-state society breathing through this story. People in the real world are already doing corvée labour, already building canals, already hauling bricks, already supporting temple economies through their bodies. A myth that places labour at the origin can function like a cosmic shrug. This is how it is. This is what you are for. Historians still argue whether these labour and creation myths primarily reflect social realities like class tension, forced labour obligations, and the temple economy, or whether they are mainly theological attempts to explain why suffering and toil exist in a world governed by gods. The debate stays open because myth often does both at once. It mirrors society, and it also shapes how society justifies itself. You move through the story and notice how the divine realm tries to manage the consequences of its own solution. Creating humans solves one problem, but it creates others. Humans multiply. Humans make noise. Humans disrupt the imagined peace of the gods. The myth treats human life not as a quiet pastoral scene, but as an expanding force that must be regulated. That regulation can appear as plagues, droughts, limits, and eventually flood motifs. Not as cruelty for cruelty's sake, but as a mythic way of explaining why the world contains resets and disasters. The cosmos, in this logic, is a managed system. When a part of the system becomes unstable, the managers intervene. Third joke, whispered kindly. You realise the ancient universe is basically running on terms and conditions, and nobody asked you to scroll, let alone agree. Now you turn the question slightly, the way you turn a stone to see its other side. If these myths describe humans as labour replacements, what does that imply about higher beings like the Anunnaki? It implies that divine purpose is often administrative, not romantic, not purely spiritual. Administrative in the sense that the world must be organised, maintained, kept within tolerable limits. Within that framework, a group of powerful gods functions like a board that approves major decisions. They do not necessarily swing the shovel themselves, but they authorise the structure. They decide who does what. They define roles. This is the part modern fringe interpretations latch onto with both hands. They say, see this is a worker story. This is a production story. This is a project with staffing problems. They treat the clay and blood recipe like engineering, like a coded memory of fabrication, like an early description of designing a workforce. You sit with that temptation without letting it sprint away, because even if you reject the literal reading, you cannot ignore the emotional truth the myth carries. People feel like they are working for something bigger than themselves. People feel like institutions demand their energy. People feel like their labour feeds powers they never meet. A myth that says you were made to work is not only an origin story, it is a worldview. It tells you what kind of universe you live in. And as the reciter's voice softens, you feel the story settle into your body the way warm air settles into a room. Purpose in this ancient frame is not discovered, it is assigned. It comes from above. It is stamped into your existence like a seal rolled into wet clay. You exhale slowly, and the lamp flame steadies. The myth does not ask whether you like your role, it simply explains why the role exists. You follow the labour story until it drops you at a crossroads, where modern desire meets ancient ambiguity. Because the moment you hear humans were made to work, your modern brain immediately reaches for the most cinematic version of that claim. You can almost feel it in the way your thoughts lean forward. A workforce needs a project needs a resource needs a motive. And then, like a shiny coin rolling across the floor of the internet, the word appears. Gold. You step into a nighttime conversation that feels half scholarly debate, half campfire rumour. Someone insists the Anunnaki came to mine gold. Someone else swears the tablets say it plainly. Someone else says the tablets never say that, and everyone is reading later ideas back into earlier myths, and you standing in the middle with sleepy eyes realise you have entered one of the biggest modern shortcuts in the whole Anunnaki story. So you do what you always do when things get loud. You slow down. A mainstream historical fact grounds your footing. Mesopotamia did have long-distance trade networks and valued metals and precious materials, including gold, but the region itself is not naturally rich in many metals, which is why trade for copper, tin, silver, and luxury goods becomes important. Temples and elites accumulate valuables, and metalworking is a real craft, but the early economic heartbeat is still grain livestock textiles and land tracked with relentless administrative care. Gold exists in the ancient world, yes. It is precious. It is shiny. It signals power. But the idea that the entire divine narrative revolves around gold mining is not something you can simply stamp onto every tablet and call it solved. Still, you respect why the gold idea caught fire. It offers a clean motive. It makes the divine feel like a corporation. It gives purpose a single object you can point at and say, that is it. First joke, soft. You can barely motivate yourself to do laundry without a reward, and suddenly you are told cosmic beings cross the heavens for a metal that humans mostly use to sit in vaults and feel important. You begin by examining the word gold the way you would examine a glittering stone in low light. Where does it actually show up? How is it discussed? What role does it play in religious and economic life? You picture temple treasuries not as secret alien storage, but as real human wealth concentration. Metals are used for jewelry ritual. Objects, gifts to deities, displays of kingship. A king loves a golden object because it shines like the sun and does not rot like wood. A priest loves a golden object because it feels worthy of divine attention. A merchant loves a golden object because it moves value across distances. But the most powerful gold in the story is not necessarily in Sumerian clay, it is in modern imagination. Here is your quirky tidbit, and it is grounded in how humans think. Gold is one of the most culturally universal symbols of value precisely because it is rare, durable, and visually striking. That makes it a perfect magnet for modern myth making. When people want to imagine ancient hidden motives, they reach for gold because gold feels like it belongs in a secret. Now you shift into the fringe territory carefully, like walking on a tiled floor that might be slippery. The gold mining narrative is strongly associated with modern alternative readings that treat Mesopotamian myths as literal accounts of extraterrestrial activity. In that story, gold is mined for a technical purpose, sometimes framed as atmospheric repair or high-tech necessity. Humans are engineered as labourers. The Anunnaki are the project managers. The temples are operation centres. The myth is a disguised report. It is a neat plot. It is also a plot that depends on reading mythic language as technical description. Historians still argue whether many details in Mesopotamian myths should be interpreted as literal cosmology, political allegory, ritual language, or layered symbolism. And this debate becomes especially sharp when modern readers claim the text must mean something technologically specific. The argument stays open because we cannot interview the authors, and the texts do not come with modern disclaimers. Second joke, gentle. You wish the tablets came with a little note that says, "This is metaphor," but ancient scribes did not write for comment sections, so here you are. So you test the gold narrative using a simple method. If a story is about labour, does it automatically mean mining? Not necessarily. Labour in Mesopotamia is often agricultural and construction labour. Digging canals, building temple platforms, hauling bricks, maintaining irrigation, harvesting grain, weaving textiles, herding animals. A city economy is a huge machine with many moving parts, and most of those parts are not underground. You picture canal workers knee-deep in mud pulling reeds, clearing silt. That is labour. You picture brickmakers shaping mud into forms, stacking them to dry. That is labour. You picture temple staff managing storehouses and distributing rations. That is labour, too quieter, but just as controlling. If a myth says humans exist to take over divine labour, it could be echoing that entire system. Not a single mining operation. The gods do not want to dredge canals. They do not want to maintain temples. They do not want to carry baskets. Humans do it. Now you consider water again, because water never stops being the main character in Mesopotamia. The gods of water and storm and river behaviour dominate anxiety. Irrigation is life, and it is also fragile. If the system fails, the city collapses. So a purpose that centres on managing water makes deep cultural sense. This is where you let another possibility breathe. What if the divine purpose in these narratives is less about extracting a resource and more about organising a society that can survive in a harsh environment? That purpose would still look like management. It would still look like a system that demands labour. It would still be unsettling in its own way, but it would not require a cosmic gold rush to explain it. Third joke, quiet. You realise the real ancient obsession is not gold, it is keeping the canals from turning into a disaster noodle. You also notice a subtler modern projection. Modern minds often assume that the most important work is industrial extraction because our own world is shaped by it. We imagine mines because we live in a world of mines, oil fields, supply chains, rare earth metals, and global resource hunger. When we look back, we sometimes see our own reflection and call it ancient truth. So you stay honest. Gold appears in the ancient world. It matters. But the leap from gold exists to the Anunnaki came for gold is a leap across a gap filled with interpretation. Still, the gold narrative teaches you something important about the larger question. People want motive. They want a reason that feels concrete. They want purpose to be a thing you can hold. Ancient myths often offer purpose in a different form. Purpose as order. Purpose as hierarchy. Purpose as ritual maintenance. Purpose as the continuation of civilization through structured labour and divine legitimacy. You stand in the dark and imagine two hands. One hand holds a piece of gold, heavy and shining. The other hand holds a clay tablet, dull and cracked, yet full of recorded obligation. Which one actually runs the world? The answer in ancient Mesopotamia is often the clay, because clay carries the rations, clay carries the laws, clay carries the king list, clay carries the myth that tells you why you work, clay carries the divine signatures. Gold shines, clay governs. You let that thought settle like dust in lamplight. The most tempting shortcut in the Anunnaki story is also the one that reveals the most about modern hunger for certainty. The ancient world is offering you something else, not a single object, but a system. A purpose that feels less like treasure hunting and more like keeping order in a world that is always threatening to slip back into chaos. You move away from shiny motives and into something far more powerful, because it is quiet and constant. The temple, not as a pretty building, not as a tourist landmark, as a living machine that breathes grain, cloth labour law, and belief. You walk through a temple courtyard in early morning light, when the air is cooler and the city feels briefly innocent. Workers arrive with baskets, priests move with practiced calm, scribes settle into their places like spiders ready to spin records. A mainstream historical fact anchors itself under your feet. In Sumerian and broader Mesopotamian city, life temples function as major economic institutions that control land, manage storehouses, employ workers, and organize large-scale production and redistribution. The temple is a religious center and an administrative hub at the same time, and this dual role shapes how people experience both gods and daily survival. You let that sink in. The temple is not separate from the economy. It is the economy in many contexts. It holds grain, it distributes beer rations, it commissions textiles, it tracks herds, it organises labour gangs, it owns fields, it receives offerings and then uses those offerings to keep the institution alive. If you want to see purpose in action, this is where you look. You follow a worker carrying a basket of barley to a storehouse entrance. The grain is poured into a large container, then measured. A scribe watches. Another official checks the amount. A seal is rolled. A line is pressed into clay. The worker's day becomes a number. First joke, soft and sleepy. You think your modern job is all spreadsheets, and then you realise ancient life is also spreadsheets just made out of mud and existential pressure. You walk deeper into the complex. You pass workshops where women and men spin, thread, weave, cloth, dye fabric. You hear the steady rhythm of looms, a sound that could lull you to sleep if it were not tied to so much obligation. You pass a place where bread is baked for rations. You smell warm grain and smoke. You pass a courtyard where animals are penned ready for sacrifice or for redistribution, depending on the day's demands. The temple system is not only spiritual, it is industrial in an ancient sense. Now your mind begins to connect the dots that matter for the Anunnaki question. If divine beings in myths are described as receiving offerings, living in temples, demanding service, assigning roles, then the temple is the human interface with that cosmic system. It is the place where the divine order becomes daily routine. In other words, if higher beings have a purpose in the human world, temples are the equipment through which that purpose is carried out. You pause at a doorway and imagine a priest explaining the logic. The god owns the land. The temple is the god's house. The workers are the god's workforce. The offerings are not bribes, they are maintenance. You feed the god, and the god sustains the city. It is a cycle that makes emotional sense, even if you do not believe in it, because it ties survival to ritual and ritual to organisation. Second joke, gentle. You realise the temple is basically the world's earliest subscription service. You pay in barley and incense, and in exchange you get cosmic stability terms and conditions apply. You watch a scribe record the distribution of beer rations to labourers. You see names, quantities, dates. It feels so modern it is almost funny. People have always wanted proof. People have always wanted accountability. People have always wanted to know who got what, because fairness is the thinnest wall between peace and chaos. Your quirky tidbit for this section arrives in a small, satisfying detail. Many rations in early Mesopotamia are measured in standardized units, and the very obsession with measurement helps drive the development of mathematics and administrative thinking. When you have to feed hundreds or thousands of workers, you cannot rely on vibes. You need units, you need systems, you need someone whose entire personality is, I will count it again. Third joke, softly. Somewhere in ancient Sumer, a person is absolutely arguing about whether that jar is truly full, and you feel oddly comforted that humanity is consistent. Now you step back and ask, what does this reveal about divine purpose? It reveals that the gods, as imagined, are not only explanations of nature, they are owners, patrons, and authorities. They justify the temple's control of resources. They justify the hierarchy that tells workers where to go and what to do. If a king rules by divine favour, the temple helps broadcast that favour. If a city needs labour coordinated, the temple provides structure. If the poor need rations, the temple distributes them, but the distribution also reinforces dependence and loyalty. This is where the Anunnaki as a category of powerful gods fit into the shape of society, a divine assembly that authorises order mirrors the human institutions that enforce it, A story about humans created to serve mirrors the temple economy, where humans literally serve the god's house. Historians still argue whether temples in early Mesopotamia should be seen primarily as religious institutions that incidentally manage economy, or as economic institutions that use religion to legitimize their control with the truth, likely varying by city and period. This debate matters because it changes the emotional flavour of the entire system. Is the temple protecting the city, or managing it, or both? You walk along a wall lined with small niches where offerings might be placed. You picture how daily devotion becomes routine. A woman brings a small loaf. A man pours a little beer. A family prays for health, rain, fertile fields. The acts are sincere. The system behind them is large and impersonal. This is the part of ancient life that makes the Anunnaki, as manager's idea, feel plausible to modern ears. The religion is managerial. The economy is managerial. The myth is managerial. Even fate is treated like something that can be decreed, assigned, recorded. And now you notice the subtle psychological effect. When you believe a god owns the land, you do not just obey a human official, you obey the cosmos. When a scribe records your ration, it is not just accounting, it is destiny written down. You pass by a high platform and you look up at it. The architecture itself is a statement. Height implies closeness to the divine. Visibility implies legitimacy. The temple is built to dominate sight lines, so no one forgets where authority lives. Your mind grows calm in the face of this, not because it is gentle, but because it is coherent. A city with thousands of people needs coherence. The temple provides it. The myths provide it. The gods provide it. And now you can name the purpose in a way that does not require gold or spaceships. In the lived world, divine purpose is enacted through institutions. It is a story that organizes labor, justifies hierarchy, and binds community to a shared ritual rhythm that makes survival feel possible. You step out of the courtyard into a street where morning light warms the mud brick. The city wakes fully. Vendors shout. Children run. A dog trots past like it owns the place. And above it all, the temple remains not only a building, but the heartbeat of a system that turns belief into bread, and bread into obedience, and obedience into stability. You step out under a night sky so clean it feels freshly washed, the kind of darkness where the stars are not polite. Background decoration, they are loud. They crowd together in sharp points. They hang above the flat land like an enormous ceiling of needles, and you suddenly understand why ancient people do not treat the heavens as distant. The heavens are close. They hover. You tilt your head back until your neck complains, and you try to do what an ancient watcher does. You stop thinking of the sky as romance. You start thinking of the sky as information, because in these cities the sky is not just pretty, it is a calendar, a warning system, a divine bulletin board, and occasionally a reason to panic politely. A mainstream historical fact settles in as gently as dew. Mesopotamian scribes and scholars develop advanced observational astronomy and mathematics over long centuries, recording celestial phenomena on clay tablets, using systematic lists of stars and constellations, and building a sophisticated tradition where the movements of the moon planets and certain stars help structure timekeeping rituals and interpretations of omens. You feel that tradition in your bones as you watch the moon rise. It is not random. It returns. It changes shape. It marks months. It guides festivals. It tells farmers when to expect seasons. It tells priests when to hold rites. In a world where survival depends on timing, the sky becomes a dependable partner, even if it is also a moody one. Then you run into the number that quietly rules your modern life without you thanking it. 60. You do not think of it as Mesopotamian when you glance at a clock, but there it is humming inside your day. 60 seconds, 60 minutes, a circle divided like a well-organized pie. The base 60 system, sexagesimal, becomes a mathematical language that lets ancient scholars handle fractions cleanly and track cycles with elegance. First joke soft and sleepy. You blame your schedule for being exhausting, but you are literally living inside an ancient math choice, and that feels like the universe's longest group project. You imagine a scribe with a tablet not writing poetry, but writing numbers in neat wedges, building the logic that lets the measure fields distribute rations and also map the heavens. Math is not separate from myth here. Math is one of the tools that makes the cosmos feel structured. You watch a planet wander. It does not stay in one place. It slides against the background stars night after night like a slow, deliberate traveller. To an ancient observer, that motion is not a physics lesson. It is a message. Planets are called wanderers because they behave like beings with intention. You find the people whose job it is to listen. Temple scholars court experts observers trained to track the sky with patient discipline. They notice when Venus appears in the dawn or the dusk. They notice eclipses. They notice strange halos around the moon. They notice comets and meteors. They notice when something breaks the expected rhythm. And when something breaks the rhythm, the heart starts asking why. This is where omen texts enter, and the mood becomes both fascinating and slightly dramatic. There are large collections of celestial omens, lists of conditions and interpretations, often structured like a calm recipe book for anxiety. If the moon looks a certain way, then a certain kind of event may follow. If an eclipse happens in a particular month, it may mean something for the king. If a planet appears in a certain region, it may signal war or plenty. Your quirky tidbit for tonight is a small detail that feels almost modern. Some omen traditions place special focus on the king's safety during eclipses, and there are rituals in later Mesopotamian practice where a substitute king can be installed temporarily to absorb the bad fate, allowing the real king to hide from the cosmic consequences until the danger passes. It is politics wearing astrology as armour. Second joke, gentle. You think your bad day is intense because your horoscope said, avoid conflict, and ancient rulers are out here hiring a decoy king because the moon looks suspicious. You let your mind drift across the structure of those omen series like Enuma Anu Enlil in later tradition, where the sky becomes a language and scholars become translators. The format itself is soothing in a strange way. It makes fear manageable. It says, we have seen this pattern. We have a category for it. We have a protocol. Protocols are comfort. Now you feel the connection to the question of divine purpose. Because if the gods are administrators of reality, The sky is one of their official channels. Celestial order becomes proof that the universe is governed. Celestial disruption becomes proof that the governors are speaking. You watch the stars and you understand why people can believe this without feeling foolish. The sky is vast and regular. It repeats with precision. It is the closest thing to law you can see. So when the sky does something unexpected, it feels personal. Historians still argue whether Mesopotamian omen traditions should be understood as an early form of scientific pattern recognition, built from careful observation, or primarily as a political and religious system for managing uncertainty and legitimizing authority, with the likely truth being an entanglement of both. This debate matters because it changes how you interpret the tablets. Are they proto-astronomy notebooks or anxiety management manuals for kings, or both at once? You keep watching and you notice the line where observation becomes interpretation. The observers are real, the data is real, the sky positions can be tracked, but the meaning assigned to those positions is where culture enters. That cultural meaning often protects the powerful. Many omens focus on the king, the city, the state, because the stability of leadership is treated as stability of the world. If the cosmos is an order, then the throne is part of it. If the throne is threatened, everything feels threatened. Third joke, soft. The sky is minding its own business, and humans are like, this is clearly about my boss, which is the most ancient workplace habit imaginable. Now the fringe current swims into view because it always does when Mesopotamia and planets share the same sentence. A lot of modern speculation grabs onto a name that gets tossed around with extra confidence. Nibiru. In modern pop culture, it can become a dramatic object, a hidden planet, a world-ending visitor, a cosmic key to everything. But in ancient contexts, the term's meaning is more slippery, sometimes referring to a crossing point, sometimes associated with a particular celestial body, depending on the text and interpretation. It is not a single universally fixed Planet X label in every tablet. It behaves like many ancient terms, context-driven, shifting, annoyingly resistant to modern certainty. You treat that as a caution sign. When a modern claim feels too clean, you check whether the ancient word actually supports that cleanliness. Ancient language is often messy on purpose because it is serving ritual politics and poetry at once. Still, the larger feeling remains powerful. The sky becomes a place where authority is written. The temple becomes the place where that authority is read. The king becomes the figure whose fate is tied to what the sky says. The people become the ones who must keep living under that enormous ceiling, hoping the signs remain favourable. You picture an observer at the top of a high platform. He has a stylus. He has a fresh tablet. He has a mind trained to notice the smallest difference in a familiar pattern. He marks the position of a planet. He notes the moon's shape. He records a halo. He writes as if the future depends on it, because in his world it does. And you standing beneath the same stars feel a strange intimacy with that act. You also look up for meaning. You also crave pattern. You also want the universe to feel structured enough that your worries can fit inside it. So when people ask about the Anunnaki's purpose, you understand why the sky becomes part of the answer. A managerial cosmos needs a schedule, a calendar, a visible rhythm that proves the system is real. It needs watchers, it needs interpreters, it needs texts that turn light into language. The stars keep shining silent and indifferent, but the human story around them is anything but indifferent. It is careful, it is anxious, it is brilliant. It is deeply, stubbornly hopeful that the heavens are not just there but communicating. You let your eyes soften, letting the points blur slightly at the edges. The sky becomes less like a grid and more like a blanket of distant fire. The numbers and omens fade into the background hum of the night, and the sense of an ordered universe lingers calm and heavy, like a promise you are not entirely sure you asked for. You stand at the edge of water that looks calm only because it has not decided what it wants to be today. The river is wide here, slow in the middle, faster near the banks, carrying reeds and silt, like it is casually rearranging the world. The air smells of wet earth and plants that live with their feet in mud. Birds cut across the sky in sharp lines, and the flat horizon makes everything feel exposed. If something comes, you will see it coming. If something rises, you will have nowhere to hide. This is where flood memory lives. Not as a single event you can date with a tidy label, but as a lived truth in a land built between rivers that can bless you and punish you with the same hands. Floods are normal and terrifying. The water rises, the canal breaks, the wall collapses, the stored grain turns into mush, and people learn the difference between a good year and a year that erases names. A mainstream historical fact settles in with steady weight. Archaeologists and historians recognize that major flooding events did occur in Mesopotamia, and flood deposits have been identified at several sites, even though there is no single clear proof of one universal flood covering the entire region at once. Local disasters are common enough to seed legends that feel enormous. You watch the river and you understand why an old story would say the world was reset by water. In this landscape, water is the closest thing you have to a reset button. You step into a temple space where a reciter's voice grows slow and serious, and the story arrives with the calm inevitability of rain clouds. A man is warned, a boat is built, animals and seeds are gathered, a storm comes, the world is drowned, a survivor offers thanks. The divine realm responds sometimes with regret, sometimes with new rules, sometimes with promises. You recognize the shape because it has travelled far beyond this land, carried by later cultures, rewritten, retold, and made into different moral lessons. But here, the feeling is less like moral theatre and more like environmental realism dressed in mythic clothing. First joke, soft and sleepy. You panic when your phone gets a splash of water, and ancient Mesopotamia is like, yes, the entire world is having a water incident. In Mesopotamian tradition, you meet flood heroes with names that shift by text and language. Ziusudra in Sumerian tradition, Atrahasis in Akkadian tradition, Utnapishtim in the Epic of Gilgamesh tradition. The role stays familiar even as the name changes like a mask worn by different faces across time. The story does not have to be identical to remain the same at the core. A warning given quietly, a plan built in secret, a disaster that arrives like a judgment, a survival that feels both lucky and burdened. You imagine the boat not as a neat little craft, but as a bulky, practical construction designed by someone who understands that water does not negotiate. It must be sealed. It must be stocked. It must outlast days of storm and drifting. You picture hands smearing pitch, tying ropes, stacking supplies, arguing about space, worrying about weight, listening to distant thunder like it is a drumline for doom. Now you notice how the flood story connects to the question of higher beings and purpose. Because the flood is not just weather, it is a decision in the mythic frame, a divine choice to reduce, reset, correct, or manage the human world. That managerial feeling returns heavy and undeniable. The world is treated like a system. When the system becomes unstable, the divine realm intervenes. Historians still argue whether the Mesopotamian flood tradition primarily preserves memory of real regional flooding and river disasters, or whether it functions mainly as a literary and theological device to explore themes like human noise, divine regret, and the limits of order. The debate stays open because the story is rooted in a real landscape and also crafted into a meaningful narrative. You walk along the riverbank and feel the reality beneath the myth. Irrigation is life. It is also risk. A canal must be maintained. A levee must be reinforced. A breach can turn a city into a wreck. So a culture that builds with mud brick and stores grain in clay-lined spaces will naturally fear water in a deep personal way. And then you meet the strange tenderness in the story, because it is not only about destruction, it is also about communication. In some versions, a clever god chooses to preserve humanity by warning the hero, sometimes through indirect means, sometimes through a wall, sometimes through a dream. The divine realm is not a single unified mind. There is disagreement. Some deities want the reset, some want mercy. The story becomes a cosmic argument about how to manage the humans who were created to work, worship, and keep the system running. Second joke, gentle. You think your family debates are intense, and then you hear a myth where the gods disagree about whether humanity should exist, and suddenly your group chat feels very small. Now you reach your quirky tidbit, and it has a slightly eerie modern echo. Some ancient flood narratives include surprisingly specific logistical details, lists of supplies, instructions for construction, descriptions of sealing and loading, which makes modern readers feel like they are reading a survival manual, hiding inside a myth. That detail can be used by anyone who wants to claim the story is literal history, or by anyone who wants to argue it is skilled storytelling that uses realism to make the myth feel true. Either way, the realism matters. It makes the flood believable. It turns cosmic drama into something you can smell, touch, and fear. You watch the flood in your mind not as a movie explosion, but as relentless water, days of storm, the river swallowing fields, roofs vanishing, people clinging to debris, the sound of rain on wood and clay constant enough to make time feel like a single long breath. Then the waters recede, and the silence afterward is the strangest part. A world emptied, washed, reshaped. A survivor stepping out onto mud that does not yet know what it will become. The survivor offers a sacrifice. Smoke rises. The divine realm smells it. That detail appears again and again in the tradition, and it carries a simple truth. After disaster, people reach for ritual. They reach for gratitude. They reach for a sense that they are seen. In some versions, the gods respond with hunger, or with relief, or with a promise. Sometimes there is regret. Sometimes there are new controls. Sometimes the divine realm decides that the next reset will not be done the same way, and a sign is placed in the sky as a reminder. Even if later traditions emphasize different symbols, the emotional core remains. The flood is a boundary line, a point where the world becomes two different worlds separated by water and memory. Third joke whispered softly, "You love a fresh start, but this is a fresh start that arrives with mud in your hair and a new fear of clouds." Now you turn the idea of purpose again, because it is the stone you keep rolling in your palm. If the Anunnaki represent divine authority and divine decision-making, then the flood narrative shows what authority can do at its most extreme. It can reset. It can enforce limits. It can treat humanity like a component in a larger machine, useful, noisy, multiplying, and therefore in need of regulation. At the same time, the flood narrative also reveals that the divine realm in Mesopotamian imagination is not purely cold management. It is complex. It argues. It regrets. It compromises. It adapts. It sets new rules, not because the universe is perfect, but because the universe is trying to remain stable. You stand in the damp air and listen to the river, and you realize the flood story is not only about what happened or did not happen, it is about the fear that the world can be undone and the hope that it can begin again. In a city built on water and mud, the greatest terror is that water will take everything. The greatest comfort is that someone somewhere has a plan, even if that plan is frightening. You let the river's sound soften your thoughts. The surface reflects the moon in broken silver. The reeds sway. The world feels held for now. And in that quiet, you understand why a reset myth becomes one of the strongest tools a civilization has. It explains catastrophe without admitting randomness. It turns disaster into narrative. It makes survival feel like selection. It makes the future feel manageable because rules can be written, promises can be made, and memory can be pressed into clay. You step into a room that smells like ink dust and modern opinions. The ancient world is still there in your mind, warm and river-scented. But now you feel fluorescent light humming overhead, the quiet click of a keyboard, the soft impatience of a person who has spent too many years arguing about a single wedge mark. The air is cooler. The walls are lined with books. Photographs of tablets sit in neat rows like mugshots of ancient ideas. This is where the Anunnaki become modern, not in the sense that the ancient texts change, but in the sense that the modern lens changes everything. Translation choices, academic debates, museum labels, popular books, documentaries with dramatic music, forums where strangers speak with the confidence of gods while wearing pyjamas. You sit at an imaginary desk and watch a scholar point at a tablet photo. The scholar is calm, careful, and slightly haunted by the fact that every translation decision becomes someone else's certainty. A sign can mean more than one thing. A damaged line can be reconstructed in multiple ways. A term can shift meaning over centuries, and the modern reader wants one clean answer, like a bedtime story with a moral. A mainstream historical fact settles in much of what we know about Sumerian and Akkadian literature comes from painstaking decipherment and translation work that accelerated in the 19th and 20th centuries as more tablets were excavated, catalogued and compared, and as scholars refined grammars, sign lists and contextual readings across huge corpora. Our access to these myths is real, but it is mediated through a chain of human interpretation. You feel that chain like links in a hand. Tablet to excavation, excavation to museum, museum to photograph, photograph to translation, translation to summary, summary to headline, headline to internet certainty. And somewhere along that chain, nuance often gets lost because nuance is slow and the modern world is allergic to slow. First joke soft and sleepy. Ancient scribes pressed wedges into clay. Modern humans press share into chaos, and both actions have consequences. You watch a translator wrestle with a line that includes a divine group term. Is it the great gods? Is it the Anunnaki? Is it a specific class or a broad phrase? The translator chooses and the choice travels. A popular book quotes that translation, then a video repeats it, then someone online says, the tablets clearly state, and suddenly a translator's careful choice becomes a weapon in someone's argument. Then you feel the modern craving for a single plot. The ancient world is full of overlapping myths, different versions, different city priorities, different gods emphasized, contradictions that do not bother the original audience the way they bother modern readers. Modern readers want a unified canon. They want a real story behind the myths. So modern storytellers build a unified story. Sometimes it is an academic synthesis, honest about uncertainty. Sometimes it is a popular simplification, tidy and entertaining. Sometimes it is a fringe reconstruction, thrilling and absolute. You watch the fringe reconstruction form like fog. A few motifs are selected because they are dramatic, divine labour, human creation, sky authority, ancient wisdom, sages the idea of a divine assembly. Then those motifs are connected into a single narrative. With modern logic, visitors arrive, need workers, engineer humans, establish kings, build temples as operational hubs, mine resources, monitor the sky, reset humanity with floods when necessary. It is a full plot. It is also a plot built from picking certain pieces and ignoring others. Historians still argue whether popular modern reconstructions of Mesopotamian myth distort the original intent by forcing a single coherent narrative onto a tradition that is naturally plural and context-driven. The debate matters because it affects what people think the tablets reveal. Are you seeing ancient thought, or are you seeing a modern story wearing ancient clothing? Your quirky tidbit for this section is about the psychology of interpretation. When people encounter damaged or incomplete texts, their brains naturally fill gaps, especially if they already expect a certain story. That gap filling is not evil, it is human cognition. But it means that confident modern claims can grow out of uncertainty like vines, wrapping around fragments until the fragment disappears under the vine. Second joke, gentle. You look at a missing corner of a tablet and your brain immediately writes an entire screenplay into the blank space and then acts surprised when someone asks for evidence. You also notice how modern media shapes perception. A museum label might use a simplified phrase for readability. A documentary might use a single dramatic translation. A narrator might say Anunnaki because it sounds mysterious even when gods would be more accurate in that context. The word becomes a brand, and brands attract clicks. Then there is the question of authority. Academic writing is cautious. It uses phrases like, possibly likely in this context, the reading is uncertain. Pop culture hates those phrases. It wants declarative sentences. It wants drama. It wants certainty that feels like comfort. So the Anunnaki get repackaged as certainty. You watch a scholar argue gently with another scholar about whether a particular term should be read as underworld judges or as high gods in assembly. The argument is slow, precise, full of references to parallel lines and grammar. Then you watch the internet take that same topic and turn it into scholars admit the truth, which is a sentence that usually means someone with a microphone got bored. Third joke, soft. You realise scholars admit is often code for someone stopped reading halfway through the paragraph. Now you shift your focus to the modern timeline of fascination. In the 20th century, as translations became more widely available, a wider audience encountered Mesopotamian myths directly or indirectly. Around the same time, modern culture developed a taste for ancient mysteries, lost civilizations, and cosmic visitors, especially as space exploration and science fiction shaped imagination. The Anunnaki idea blooms in that cultural soil. It feels perfectly timed. Ancient tablets plus modern aliens equals endless content. And in fairness, some of that fascination is beautiful. People care about ancient Sumer. People want to learn. People want to feel connected to deep time. The danger is not curiosity. The danger is replacing complexity with a single thrilling answer and then refusing to let complexity back in. So you treat modern interpretations like layers of sediment, academic sediment, popular sediment, fringe sediment. Each layer tells you more about the people doing the interpreting than about the ancient scribe who first pressed the wedge. But you do not mock the urge, you understand it. Ancient Sumer feels like a miracle. The first cities, the first writing, the temples, the math, the sky watching, the myths that sound uncomfortably managerial. When you feel overwhelmed by modern life, it is tempting to imagine a hidden hand behind civilization's origin, a plan, a purpose. You sit with that temptation the way you sit with the hum of a fan. It is steady. It is soothing. It makes the chaos feel organized. Then you bring yourself back to the clay's stubborn reality. The tablets are not a single story. They are a library written by many hands across many centuries, preserved by accident and effort, reconstructed by modern work, and reimagined by modern hunger. So in this room, with the books and the cool air, you accept a humble truth. Any true purpose you claim to find will always be filtered through interpretation. The best you can do is be honest about what the ancient texts actually emphasize: order, legitimacy, labour, ritual, maintenance, divine authority, and the constant anxiety of living in a world where water can erase everything. And then you can be honest about what modern minds add a craving for one plot, one motive, one secret. You let the fluorescent hum fade. You let the books blur into shadow. You let the ancient river smell return. Because the next step is not to argue forever about who is right. The next step is to gather the strongest interpretations, ancient and modern, and ask what kind of purpose they all point toward, even when they disagree. You arrive at the place where the mind wants a final answer, the way a tired traveller wants a door that stays shut behind them. The city is quieter now. The temple fires have burned down to coals. The streets hold only a few late footsteps, and the sky above is a deep bowl of black with a thin moon hanging like a calm question. You stand in that hush with everything you have gathered in your hands, and you realize the Anunnaki's true purpose is not one sentence. It is a cluster of functions layered like clay pressed again and again. So you do the ancient thing. You assemble. Not an alien council, not a cinematic tribunal, but a careful gathering of meanings. In the ancient framework, the strongest, most consistent purpose of the highest divine powers is to authorize order. They are the weight behind kingship, the sanction behind law, the explanation behind why the city's hierarchy feels inevitable. When a text says kingship descends from heaven, it is not giving you a landing report. It is giving you legitimacy served hot. It tells the citizen obey because your world is aligned with the cosmos. A mainstream historical fact settles gently. Mesopotamian political ideology often ties kingship and justice to divine approval, with rulers presenting themselves as chosen by gods and responsible for maintaining order, building temples, and ensuring prosperity through proper ritual and governance. Even when the details vary, the pattern is stable. Power wants to look sacred. You feel the truth of that in your bones because you have walked through the temple economy, the ration lists, the seal impressions. The divine is not only in the sky, it is in the warehouse. So one interpretation is simple and strong. The Anunnaki represent divine authority that makes social order feel real. Their purpose is to stabilize civilization through a story that binds people to roles. Then there is the purpose that sits right next to it, uncomfortable but honest. Labor. The myths about divine workers and the creation of humans to take over work suggest a worldview where existence is duty. The cosmos is a managed system, and humans are part of the staffing plan. Even if you read it symbolically, the symbolism is sharp. People in a complex society feel burdened, and they explain that burden as cosmic design. First joke, soft and sleepy. You wanted a spiritual origin story and ancient Mesopotamia. Hands you congratulations, you are hired with no vacation policy. Now you add another layer. Knowledge transmission, the sages, the Apkallu motifs, the watery wisdom of Enki, the idea that civilization's key powers can be granted, transferred, even treated like sacred tools. This suggests a purpose that is not just to rule, but to equip, to make the human world capable of running. Whether you treat that as literal teachers or symbolic lineage, it functions as a story that says, we received civilization, we did not invent it alone. Second joke, gentle. You realize the oldest flex is not, I built this, it is, I inherited this from a primeval expert, and humans have never stopped loving that line. Then comes the purpose that shadows the whole system regulation. Flood narratives, omen traditions, temple protocols, divine decrees all point to a managed universe that corrects itself when it becomes unstable. Disasters become narrative tools that explain why the world contains resets and limits. The divine realm is not portrayed as perfectly kind, but as committed to maintaining an order that can include harsh corrections. Historians still argue whether Mesopotamian divine governance in myth should be read mainly as an expression of real social control and institutional power, or a sincere theology grappling with chaos, suffering, and the fragile nature of civilization. The debate matters because it changes your emotional conclusion. Are the gods a mirror of institutions, or are institutions a mirror of gods? The truth can be tangled. Now you acknowledge the modern layer without letting it swallow the ancient. The modern fringe interpretation wants a single purpose, with a single motive, often framed in industrial terms, extraction, engineering, control. It reads myth as report. It finds satisfaction in turning symbols into technology. You do not have to agree with it to see why it thrives. It is a modern answer to a modern itch. It gives you one plot. It gives you a reason. It makes you feel like chaos has a hidden manager, and that is strangely comforting even when the manager sounds a little terrifying. Third joke, quiet. The idea of cosmic overlords is alarming, but you also admit that part of you loves having someone to blame for everything from bad weather to your missing socks. So what is the true purpose you can responsibly take from the tablets without forcing them into a single modern fantasy? It is this, the Anunnaki function, as a name for the weight of divine authority that makes civilization feel sanctioned, organized, and inevitable. Their purpose is to hold the story of order in place. They are the mythic guarantee that kingship is not merely a power grab, that law is not merely human preference, that labour is not merely suffering, and that the cosmos itself is structured enough to be interpreted. In this world view, the universe is a temple city scaled up. It has roles, it has decrees, it has archives, it has consequences. It is not random, it is governed. And now you let the pacing soften. You let the city fade into quieter details. A last oil lamp flickers behind a reed screen. A dog curls into a tighter circle in an alley. A breeze slides along the canal, making the water whisper against the bank. Above the stars remain steady, distant points that do not explain themselves yet invite explanation anyway. You imagine a scribe at the end of his day. His fingers ache. His eyes sting from lamplight. He smooths the last tablet he will write tonight, and he sets it aside to dry. He does not know your language. He does not know your century. He does not know the word Anunnaki will become a modern obsession. He only knows he has recorded something that matters to his world, a ration, a hymn, a king's claim, an omen, a myth that tells people why their lives fit into a larger pattern. And you, listening in the dark, begin to feel the strange comfort of that. Not that the universe is controlled by something you can name, but that humans have always tried to make meaning out of the same fears and hopes you carry. So you let the last images grow softer, as if someone is lowering the volume on the world. The canal becomes a ribbon of shadow. The temple becomes a dark shape against the stars. The scribe's wedges become tiny marks that look like bird tracks in dried mud. The arguments about purpose become less urgent because your body is tired and your mind is ready to float. You breathe slowly, in and out. The ancient world is still there, steady and distant like a story told at the edge of sleep. The gods and the people and the cities and the rivers all settle into a single quiet feeling. That order is fragile. Meaning is crafted, and you are allowed to rest inside the hum of a long human attempt to understand. Your eyelids grow heavy. The fan hum becomes the only ritual you need. The stars blur into a soft field of light behind your eyes. And as you drift, you do not need a single final answer. You only need the calm sense that even the oldest clay can carry a lullaby. Now the wind down begins slower, softer, longer in breath. You let the last lamp dim in your mind, and you imagine the river's surface, smoothing out the ripples, settling the reeds, turning into gentle silhouettes. The city's edges blur, and the ancient voices become quiet murmurs, like distant conversation through a wall. The weight of questions loosens not because they are solved, but because sleep does not demand proof. Sleep only asks you to exhale. You picture the clay tablets resting in darkness, safe and cool, their marks intact, their stories held like seeds in earth. You are not responsible for carrying every mystery tonight. You are not required to decode the universe before morning. You are allowed to be curious and still be tired, to wonder and still let go. The sky above Mesopotamia becomes a soft blanket of night. The stars continue their slow, indifferent shining, and the world continues steady enough for you to rest. Your breath lengthens, your shoulders unclench, your thoughts drift like a small boat that no longer needs a destination. And in the quiet, you feel something simple and calming. Humans have always looked up, always searched for meaning, always tried to name the powers that shape their lives. You are part of that long, gentle habit. But tonight, you do not have to hold the whole history in your hands. You can set it down just for a while, like a tablet placed carefully on a shelf. So you let the last image fade to a dim glow. Water reeds, moonlight, the soft hum of the world staying together. Your mind grows quieter. Your body grows warmer. Your eyelids grow heavier.